Imagine we're standing in one of the caves in Lascaux in France. We're surrounded by amazing drawings of human figures and animals and abstract signs, many of them in mineral pigments and some of them even etched into the stone. There's a figure of a bull that's almost 17 feet in length. There are animals standing with crossed legs, which give us just a little bit of a hint of a deeper space or something like perspective. These paintings were done nearly 20,000 years ago, and we can't really know why or who did them. But when we look at them, we feel a sense of connection to our deep human past. And that connection is around the desire to make stories visible, the desire to make sense of life through drawing and other forms of representation, and the desire to create a connection to the world around us by giving images of that world back to our fellow human beings, and making sure that they become a part of history as well. And we're back to a painting we've seen already once before, Jacques-Louis David's intervention of the Sabine women from 1799. We talked about its complexity, we talked about the weight of human figures. Now I want to talk a little bit about the circumstances of the making of the painting and about the story that it tells. The painting picks up from an earlier painting by Poussin called The Rape of the Sabine Women, and it tells the story of the founding of Rome, but it tells it as a story of reconciliation between two warring groups, the Romans and the Sabines, who just so happen to be husbands and fathers of the same women. And we see them just as they are about to go to war. And we see a woman, one of the daughters and wives, intervening between the men, asking them to stop and make peace instead. This is basically a great painting about reconciliation. It's a great story of the founding of a nation, but it's a story that's told through a family perspective, a perspective of various sides of a family coming together despite their differences. David conceives of this painting while he's actually in prison for his involvement in the Reign of Terror. That's the most radical and bloody period of the French Revolution. He's visited by his estranged wife, who happens to support the monarchy and is pretty upset about David's revolutionary tendencies, and likewise so is David, because the reprisals for those involved in the Reign of Terror were the most severe. Robespierre, the leader of that period, had already been put to death, and David was really afraid that he was going to be put to death as well. So he embarks on this painting that will take him 4 years to make, and it's a 4-year-long apology to his country for his involvement in that revolutionary moment, and to his wife for his involvement in that moment as well. And it's kind of amazing to think of your husband making a 4-year apology to you. So I think those of us who are married might stop and pause and think about the enormity of that for just a moment. It's a very public painting, again, on a monumental scale, that manages to make a sort of bridge between the ancient past, the past of Roman history, and the present moment, the moment of the French Revolution, and makes it in a grand and public way, using the language of neoclassicism with the kind of heroic, robust figures, nudity used as the language of classicism as well, but also as a private story as well, a story of a family reconciliation, and also a story most notably in which women take a primary role. Well, David's painting works for him. It makes a splash as a painting, and it convinces the new government that he's no longer a threat. It's avidly viewed by paying customers at the Louvre until 1805, and David himself goes from being a painter of the Revolution to a painter of empire, and he does some sort of really amazing paintings of Emperor Napoleon in the early part of the 19th century. So we're looking at a moment where artists of ambition had the job of giving public images back to that public that created a connection between the historical past and the contemporary moment. And we're looking at David as a really amazing practitioner of what gets called in the lexicon of the Academy of Fine Arts, the Académie des Beaux-Arts, in Paris, history painting. That is to say, paintings done on a monumental scale that have complex compositions with multiple figures, often nude, and they take a great deal of time and materials to make. It's worth saying, that 4-year-long apology, and also a great deal of fluency in drawing. One apprentices and learns to draw the male nude over a period of years in order to get to this level of expertise. So these paintings were largely supported by the state, and the ability to make such a painting depended partly on all the things that we think about artists having, you know, a certain kind of gift for art, a certain dedication to their craft, but also an access to a certain form of education. So one of the questions that will preoccupy us for the rest of today's lecture is who has access to the stories, the skills, the time and materials it takes to make a history painting. And I found myself thinking about this again when I first came to Cal Arts, because at my previous school, San Francisco Art Institute, which has quite a good painting department, anatomy and figure drawing was taught in the painting school. And at Cal Arts, anatomy and figure drawing is taught in the animation program, and the School of Visual Arts there are many painters there, but is largely invested in developing conceptual skills, and it's the animation program that is really invested in developing anything approaching the kind of fluency of treatment of the figure that you see in David's work. So we're going to make another big historical leap, so stay with me, from David's intervention of the Sabine women to Picasso's major monumental mural painting, Guernica, from 1937. This work is 25.5 feet long and more than 11.5 feet high. It was shown to the public for the first time in July 1937 in the Spanish Republic's pavilion at the Paris World's Fair. And it is also a story that uses Picasso's very individualized and stylized language of motifs and form to tell a very contemporary story. Earlier that year, in 1937, in the midst of the Spanish Civil War, the Basque town of Guernica was bombed by air raid, saturation bombed by German military planes, helped out by a few Italian military planes. And it was really the first saturation bombing in history. And one of the first moments when an act of war was carried out against a wholly civilian population in modern history, and it opened up a kind of era of people being afraid for their lives in times of war, irrespective of whether they're soldiers and in the military or civilians and supposedly safe at home, that in many ways lasts on until this day. So Picasso painted this particular painting out of a great feeling of urgency. He manages to complete the whole work in about 5 weeks to be in the Spanish Republic's pavilion. And it is often regarded as one of the most quintessential statements of an artist being able to mobilize their own personal pictorial language in the service of public storytelling, public memory making, public expression in 20th century art. Picasso's Guernica demonstrates its profound affinity with the tradition of history painting, even in its modern iconography and its modern pictorial structure. But it's worth saying that Picasso actually had access to that tradition in part because he had classical training as a young artist. His father worked at the art school in Barcelona, and Picasso was introduced to classical drawing and demonstrated incredible fluency in it from a very, very, very early age. At the same time, it's worth thinking about who did not have access to this kind of training and what that meant in terms of the kinds of stories that could be told. So I show you this photograph by Thomas Akins. It's a photograph of the women's modeling class at the Pennsylvania Academy studio in about 1882. And what you see is the women's drawing class, obviously, and they're not drawing from the heroic male nude. They're not drawing from a living nude model. They're drawing from a cow. And that was because at the time it was thought to be really inappropriate and lacking propriety for women to be exposed to the male nude in public and to be drawing from the nude in general. That seems really antiquated now, but it had real consequences for women artists in the 19th century. So when we look at a work like Rosa Bonheur's The Horse Fair from 1853 to 1855, we should be understanding it as more than just a painting of animals. Rosa Bonheur was a major figure in 19th century French art. She was active throughout the mid to late 19th century, and she had all the ambitions of a history painter, and we can see that in actually the compositional organization of this painting, the complex intertwining of figures, the heightened sense of emotional drama and urgency. But we're in everyday life in Paris. We're not in ancient Rome or ancient Greece, and we are seeing an artist who did not have access to classical training because it simply wasn't possible or appropriate for women to do so, and yet had looked very, very carefully at the history of heroic painting and tried to take it on in her own terms. It took a great deal of doing on her part, we should say. She learned figure drawing on the hoof. She went to the slaughterhouses and to the horse trading yards in order to study the animals from life. She spent a great deal of time trying to develop a fluency in organizing complex forms through animal models. She had to actually petition the Parisian police to be able to wear pants to go to work in such places as slaughterhouses and horse yards, where women weren't supposed to be in the first place, but women in large and cumbersome crinoline dresses, as it was fashionable to wear in the mid-19th century, would have really had a hard time doing any kind of artistic work. In all sorts of ways, the history of art in the 20th century, and the 21st century for that matter, is a history of greater and greater questioning of access to vocabulary and tools and times and materials, of what kinds of stories can be told and who will tell them, of how we relate to our past and how we relate to our present. Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party is one example of a pointed questioning of the conventions of history painting. When we turn to something like the work that we're going to end with today, Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial from 1982, we see an incredibly powerful solution to the challenge to create a work that functions effectively as a site of collective memory in the absence of collective consensus on what one's feelings about that memory should be. It's worth saying for all of us, and especially those of us who might have not have been born then, that the 1960s and 70s and 80s in the United States and elsewhere were a time of great conflict and cultural upheaval. Lin's decision to create a monument through rigorously abstract forms that substitute for a narrative story the simple recitation of the names of those who died in the Vietnam War created incredible controversy at the time because it rejected the language of a sort of classical heroicism, and at the same time has proven to be one of the most effective sites for collective memory in American history. People go every day to the wall to find the names of family and friends and to remember just for a moment that past and what they lost as a result of that past. But it stands not only as a place of reconciliation, and we started off talking about conflict and reconciliation, but as a site of permanent contestation over the language of expression, because when we look at the monument that's cited right next to it, Frederick Hart's The Three Soldiers from 1984, we see a question posed permanently about the appropriate language for remembering and representation of important moments in history, important moments of collective memory, and important moments of national identity. Should the language be abstract? Should it be representational? Should it gesture towards the language of the heroic body and the classical past? Or should it find new forms to address the contemporary circumstances of history and memory? These questions are irresolvable, but they're questions that we'll continue to think about in the rest of this week's lectures.